Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, welcome back to the midweek Through a Scottish Prism. As you know, last week we started broadening our horizons. We all want Scotland to be independent, but we want to know what kind of world we're going into, and it's important that we start educating ourselves and finding out what's going on out there, and this is part of it. And today we're going to do one on the Middle East, peace breaking out, and I'm looking forward to introducing you to the guests we have with us today. But I'll start, of course, with our first guest, which is you know too well, our Yvonne Ridley. Yvonne, my friend, how are you?
I'm great. Great
Good.
to be here. Lovely sunny day in the Borders.
Good. Excited about today's guests and chat?
I am, yes, because I know that we get really wound up about Scottish independence and all the troublesome crisis at the moment. But, you know, I have this dream that Scotland can get independence, but furthermore can help reshape and be a soft power broker in troubled areas like the Middle East. And we've got no enemies, Roddy. Well,
internal ones.
No, we've got no enemies in Scotland. We've got no history of invading countries, unlike our neighbours in the south. But whenever I travel around the world and people say, "Where are you from?" and I say Scotland, there's an automatic smile and respect on people's faces. And I think that we could really build on that. And we've got the reputation and background for philosophy, peace, education, development, all the ingredients needed to become a peace broker.
Indeed, and let's talk about that and start getting our guests in. My first guest is Dr. Anas Altikriti. Now, I'll just read here so I don't miss out anything. Born in Iraq in 1968, moved to the UK at the age of 3, has done a Master's in Translation and Interpreting at Edinburgh University. Well done. PhD in Political Science from London. Lectured in several universities, including Edinburgh, from 95 until 12, leading figure in the international anti-war movement and anti-racism campaigner. Dr. Altikriti is a past president of the Muslim Association of Britain, a campaigner for Palestinian rights, a hostage negotiator. Well, we might need that to get some of the guests. You might be needing one yourself because we might like you so much we keep you. So all of that allows me to bring in Dr. Anas Altikriti.
Hello, Roddy. How are you doing? How's everyone?
I'm doing very well. And yourself?
Great to see you all.
Good. And it's nice to know that you were at Edinburgh University, both as a student and as a lecturer.
I was in Edinburgh, and yes, that's where I got my master's degree, and where I lectured also for about 4 to 5 years. So yes, it has a special place in my heart. It's
a great city.
It is.
Obviously, it's not the best city in Scotland, but it's a great city all the same. And we're delighted that you're here to join us with your expertise on the Middle East, which we will be very much leaning on. We're also, oops, I pressed the wrong button there. I've managed to delete our next guest's bio by pressing the wrong button, which is quite embarrassing. We're joined by Dr. David Miller, who will introduce himself for me. I do apologize, David, I hit the wrong button and deleted your bio.
Hello, Roddy. Thank you for having me, and hello to Anas and to Yvonne. So my name is David Miller. As you can probably tell from the remnants of my accent, I'm from Scotland. I was brought up in Edinburgh, so I know Edinburgh quite well, and I then lived in Glasgow for about 30 years before migrating down to the south of England in search of work. I'm now a former professor of political sociology at the University of Bristol after I was sacked a year and a half ago after a 3-year-long campaign by the Zionist movement to have me removed. and I now work as a producer for Palestine Declassified, which is a weekly TV show on Press TV. I write a column for Iodine. I've been writing for Electronic Intifada, etc. I have my industrial tribunal coming up in October, where I will take the university to court to claim wrongful dismissal, and that's me.
Excellent. Well, you see, folks, we have experts here on the Middle East. If I could start with you, Anas, the title of this particular show we're putting out is Peace Breaks Out in the Middle East. I mean, I'm now in my 7th decade, and I can hardly remember when we've had total peace there. But the developments in the last few months have been nothing short of remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing to be said is that the term itself is problematic. The Middle East is very much a colonial sort of concept, and it's something that I put out there. I don't sort of, I'm not stuck up about it, but it's good to know that the center of the world was always Europe. It was colonial Europe. So, everything was subject to where the center of the world was, which was Europe, and particularly the British Empire. And therefore, that particular area was seen as the Middle East. And then there was the Far East, and then there was the Southern East and the such, and then there's the West. So it's a colonial sort of term, but moving on from that, I mean, it's important to note that we're talking about one of the most volatile, but at the same time one of the most rich and wholesome regions in the entire world. I hail from that region, so of course I'm going to be biased. But in all honesty, I mean, if you talk about whether it be natural resources, whether it be mineral resources, obviously people remember oil, but besides that, you have the most important asset that nations of the world throughout the entire world are seeking and desperately wanting, and that is the human resource. You're talking about a population of, let's say, around 400 to 500 million, more than 60% of whom are under the age of 35. Now, that is something you can't beat. You're talking about the next 50 to 60 years of people who can work, who can produce, and unfortunately, because of those riches, that particular region has been the epicenter of the focus of colonial powers, of interest-seeking powers, of commercial accumulating powers, seeing that region merely as a marketplace. And as a result, we have seen violence for the past 60, 70 years. And we've seen issues rise that were never there before, such as the sectarian conflicts and the cultural conflicts and the like. But at the very heart of all of this, is definitely the issue of Palestine. What happened in 1948, I would even go before that, since the Balfour Declaration in 1917, we have seen the creation of the longest running crisis, and that was created in a way that was unprecedented, and that remains until this very day, that remains an anomaly in world politics. If you were to sort of tell any human being, any sane human being, any rational human being walking down the street, how about we create a model just like what was created in 1948 today, they would label you as being a nutcase. Absolutely absurd. No one would accept it. But yet here we are, over 70 years on, 75 years on, and the world is still shaped by that particular crisis, and especially the Middle East.
Yeah, just two things. You referred to the Middle East as just the way the colonial powers, ex-colonial powers, and America view it as a marketplace. I would suggest they don't see it as a marketplace. They see it as a piggy bank where they can take out whatever they want, however they want, for whatever use they want, and not certainly for the benefit of the locals.
Absolutely.
Would you not say that's a fairer description?
I would say so, of course. I mean, it's unfortunate that in order to keep that particular region under control, despots, sellouts were installed as rulers, given absolute free hand to do to their own people as they will in order to maintain that power. Long-term contracts that were sold off for measly gains for those particular families or rulers or dictators, but that kept Western interests, whether it be British or French or now American, in place for decades to come. Generations of those populations that I talked to you about, generations will continue to be paying to those who hold the leases to their own riches, to their own minerals, to their own resources, that will keep them subjugated, they will keep them under control, and they'll keep them in line, basically.
David, you know, chaos and war actually suits the colonial mindset. You know, keep them divided, fight them on themselves, and we can go on with a bit of pillage. But some of the coming togethers in the last few months, for example, just this week, the Saudi foreign minister going to Damascus, talk of bringing Syria back into the Arab League. Some of these things coming together are just fabulous to hear, are they not?
They are. I mean, this started most noticeably with the Chinese brokered rapprochement between Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Now, that was something which took the world, certainly America and also Israel, by surprise, and which is not welcomed either in Tel Aviv or in Washington. Yeah. It's pretty extraordinary to have the Chinese do that, not because they did it or because they wanted to do it, but because they evidently have the authority to do something like that, to bring together two countries which have been at each other's throats for the last decade at least. And what's followed from that, of course, has been what appears now to be a carefully choreographed series of moves. So not only Iran and the Saudis coming together, but Syria and the Saudis burying the differences, the UAE escorting Bashar al-Assad on fighter jets, a fighter jet escort. The movement between the UAE and Qatar to restore relationships after a huge boycott campaign led by the UAE and the Saudis and with the Israelis in the background. Now that being put in the past, and you have seen the withdrawal, the exchange of prisoners in the Yemen conflict, the withdrawal of both Saudi and, it seems, UAE forces, including from the islands off Yemen, which have been occupied by the UAE with their Israeli allies. That all of that is extraordinary, an extraordinary change, and it's in the context also, let's remember, of the emerging unity that there has been in what's now called the Unity Intifada in Palestine between the Palestinian factions, again brokered outside Palestine, such that the Palestinian factions are now operating in unity inside Palestine and Gaza, so that there's been all these new groups have been announced, the Falcon's Nest, the Lion's Den, which are armed groups made up of not just of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Indeed, even members of Fatah, who, of course, have the problem of being associated with and part of the Palestinian Authority, the Quisling Authority, which is allowed by the Israelis to run the government of the West Bank. So that this is also a part of this process of a new unity in West Asia. As Anas correctly says, we shouldn't be calling it Middle East, it's the west part of Asia. And that is in the context also, let's remember, of a wider unity that there has been in what's called the axis of resistance, which encompasses Syria, Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, some of the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, the Palestinian resistance, and indeed, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, that is all of these things are interacting with each other and show quite a dramatic change in West Asia in relation to the power both of the US and of Israel. And it's a challenge to Israel in particular. I noticed the other day that Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, said, oh yes, well, the rockets that were sent into Israel from the north, from Syria, and indeed from Gaza the other day, they elicited a response from the Zionist entity, he said, but they know that they cannot make a significant response because they know that they would suffer the consequences. And if you remember those rockets the other day, which killed virtually nobody, and the Israeli response, quite a significant bombing raids by the Israelis, again, killed nobody. And I think that's not an accident. So we're seeing carefully choreographed results of this peace process in Israel-Palestine, such that it looks like the Israelis are finding it difficult to take action against the Palestinians, notwithstanding that there is this horrific assault on Al-Aqsa in Al-Quds in Jerusalem, on the mosque, with the invasion of settlers and the attempt by some settlers to conduct Passover sacrifices of goats and the like. So there's a huge conflict with that, but it seems that the Israelis are finding it difficult to make a response to that in relation to the missiles which have come in relation to Syria and in relation to Gaza, which is what's been called for by the settlers. So the Israelis, I think, are in a difficult position, and in perhaps the weakest position they have been in for a very significant amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Yvonne, the last thing Israel in particular, or the United States want, is pan-Arab unity. That kind of upsets their apple cart. But when you hear about countries like UAE and Saudi now willing to deal for oil, not with the petrodollar, but in dirhams or whatever currency you're wanting to pay in, sir, and the Saudis are doing the same with rubles and yuan, it's weakening the American influence, surely, ongoing.
Well, wherever there is a problem in that region, American hands are usually in evidence. And the Americans have never been honest peace brokers in the region. They've pushed forward their own foreign policy, which is America first, center foremost. Everything is manipulated for America's benefit. And when you look at Israel and Palestine, and we're talking about a territory that isn't the size of a South African game park, but Israel is there as America's watchdog in the Middle East. It's a nuclear power. It is. It was declared just a few years ago the biggest threat to world peace, and it is like having a ticking time bomb there. And Anas is right. Everything in the Middle East can't be resolved until Palestine is sorted out. And even as we're talking now, the Israelis are grabbing more and more Palestinian territory. If you turned around to somebody and said, draw me a map of Israel, they couldn't, because this is an entity with no borders, but it's ever changing. And it is a boil on the face of human rights. Mm-hmm. And until it is sorted out, I was going to say lanced, but then I'd be accused by the Zionist lobby of wanting to wipe Israel off the face of the map, which I'm not. But until it is sorted out, there will forever be division in the Middle East. I think the fact that China has expressed an interest as acting as a peace broker is significant. because, as I said before, America has never been an honest peace broker. It's never gone in there with an even hand. And, you know, as Anas said, it's gone on for 75 years. But as we know through history, everything has a start and an ending. And I think that we're,
in the end game at least,
in my lifetime, we'll see the end of this conflict, which has cost so many innocent men, women, and children their lives.
Yeah. But of course, the two things, you know, one, you know, as Jeremy Corbyn found to his cost, if you show any kind of pro-Palestine sympathies, which I have, you're immediately a Holocaust-denying, Jew-hating, you know, absolutely, you know, everything you can think, any name you can think of. But Anas, the Yemen, probably the most underreported war and human catastrophe in mankind's history, the Western media have, you know, purposely not shown to their audience. Can we, two things, one, can we expect a full peace there? Is that now within grasp?
In order to answer that question, there is a little bit of background work that needs to be done. There's a little bit of mapping that needs to be done. I was thinking about this once. David mentioned the term Pan-Arab, or when you asked David about the Pan-Arab unity. Let's not jump to that right now, because I think we're still you know, quite a significant distance away from that. And one of the, but I'd like to agree absolutely with what Yvonne just said. And I think that the biggest change that we have seen over the course of the past few years is the realization of the Saudis that they needn't to be at the behest of the Americans so much. They needn't to be absolutely 100% selling out to Saudi time and time again. That realization is new, but it's extremely significant on a strategic point of view, because now they're basically, doing a little bit of saber rattling, telling the Americans, by the way, we can also deal with the Chinese. We can also deal with the Russians. We can also deal with the Indians. So we have places to go. We're not at your behest. We're not entrapped within. And I think that particularly is an incredibly important change within the geopolitics of the region. Now that has put them opposite to the axis led by the Emiratis, by the United Arab Emirates. Because the United Arab Emirates, in coalition with the Israelis, is sort of trying to form a bloc, and for years now trying to undermine Saudi's importance and significance within the region, within the Muslim world, because of its holy sites. So this has created, and by the way, the Yemen conflict, the fact that it's taken over 10 years, 12 years almost, and at this absolutely horrendous cost of human lives and suffering, and absolutely obliterated a country that is so beautiful, so rich, so absolutely sublime, like Yemen, is because the Emiratis and the Saudis were at loggerheads. And this is something that wasn't really brought to the fore much. At times we used to hear snippets about what the Emiratis wanted to do, the kind of ports that they sort of leased, not to operate, but in order to quell the Saudi advances and the such. The actual militias that the Emiratis created were there in order to fight the forces that the Saudis were backing. So this particular conflict is ongoing, and it's showing its face quite clearly now with what's happening in Sudan. I'm sure you're following the two factions that are fighting each other. One is backed heavily by the Emiratis, and the other is actually backed, although tacitly and not really overtly, by the Saudis. So this has been actually the essential problem of Yemen. Now, coming back to your question, I hope so. I think there isn't a sane human being out there that doesn't hope so, that this will bring an end to the suffering of the millions of Yemenis that they have been, encountering. The crisis inside Yemen is immeasurable. I mean, we're still to find out the real scale of the suffering and the destruction that has been created in Yemen. Now, can we go back to, let's say, 2010, 2011 Yemen? I personally don't think that that's possible in the next foreseeable future. Let's say the next year, 2 years, 3 years. I think that there are still dynamics that need to be put in place in order for that to happen. But we can only hope so. The dynamics in the region, especially between the Saudis and the Emiratis, as well as what the Israelis are doing, is going to be very, very interesting. Obviously, we're tragically not talking about another Arab power that we ought to be talking about, and that is Egypt. And the reason for that is that, unfortunately, under the current military regime, Egypt has been absolutely obliterated and has become an economic disaster. It's a catastrophe. And we're just waiting for the time when Egypt will announce its official bankruptcy and hence be delivered to the IMF, to the World Bank, to whoever it is that will unfortunately create another peg and another wedge in the region to avoid the stability and to avoid or to delay that pan-Arab unity that you spoke about.
I'm old enough to remember when Egypt were the number one Arab country. They were the strongest, the wealthiest, the most influential.
Yep.
That's how that's changed. And the other, I'm already being educated, and that's why you're here, gentlemen. I assumed that the Saudis and the UAE were strong allies, and so to hear what you're telling me today, I thank you. It's an education for me, because my next question was to you, David, is the ongoing that this Saudi, pulling away a wee bit from the United States and not just dealing in other currencies, but it's now talking about going full into BRICS. And I thought that UAE, because its economy is kind of pretty well tied up as well with towards Saudi, will they go in with them? And what effect will that have on the relationship with America?
Well, I think that the expansion of the BRICS is a direct challenge to US dominance in the world, and a direct challenge to dollarization and the power of the petrodollar. Yes, the Saudis are talking about other currencies, all sorts of countries. We hear almost every day of a new country deciding to agree with another country to deal either in local currency or in yuan or in some kind of common currency. So I see just yesterday or today, the Russians and the Venezuelans are agreeing. There's a question about using the Mir payment system, which is the Russians' replacement for the SWIFT payment system, which they stopped having access to as a result of the sanctions. You can in Havana, Cuba today, you can withdraw money from a bank with your card through the Mir payment system. The Venezuelans are now getting on board with that. The Iranians are getting on board with that. So these individual small changes, which come in the news, or depending where you get your news, of course, almost every day, are signs of the creeping de-dollarization of the world economy, and a sign of impending, already existing multipolarity. Now, these won't solve all problems in the world, but they are a direct challenge to US power, and the US doesn't really know what to do about it. I mean, its response really is to say, well, we'll just sanction these people more. And of course, what's happened with Ukraine is that the sanctions have not worked, and that's the extraordinary thing. I think what I find the most extraordinary about it really was, the European Union. It was a vehicle, whatever you might say about some of the positive things that people talk about the European Union, but largely it was a vehicle economically for neoliberalization, for privatization, for contracting out, and all the things which came with Thatcherism in this country, spread across the whole of the European continent by the EU. So even if you might oppose that, which I always have, I always had the idea that the people who ran the EU understood capitalism. They understood how it worked. And yet, when we see the sanctions on Russia, they didn't appear to understand that they wouldn't work because Russia didn't need the things that they were being sanctioned over. So Russia already is a massive producer of oil. Belarus is, what is it, the second biggest producer of agricultural fertilizers in the world. So actually what's happened with the sanctions is that they have rebounded on the West, and they have much more radically affected the West. In fact, the Russian economy appears to be going from strength to strength. It's got inflation under control, and wages are rising, in contrast to what's happening in Europe. So what surprised me about the European Union people was that they didn't appear to understand that that's not how capitalism operates. In order to impose sanctions, you've got to be able to constrict the things which the country needs. And Russia doesn't need those things because it's almost self-sufficient. And that's because it's been developing in that direction. So I think that there's a massive miscalculation by European Union bureaucrats, and indeed by the Americans. But the key thing, I think, that the lesson we learned from this is the extraordinary way in which the Americans have acted. So people say, the Americans are fighting the Russians. And yes, of course they are. It's a proxy war in Ukraine. It's really the Americans fighting the Russians. But really, what's happening with Europe? Why is it that the Americans have bombed the Nord Stream pipeline? Why did they do that? That's a direct attack on one of their key allies, Germany. And what did the Germans say about that? Well, nothing. They didn't say anything at all about being attacked, directly attacked, but let's be frank, in a terrorist attack by the US. And so what we see really with the sanctions and with the Nord Stream attack is a direct attack by the US on European economies, on the Germans, one of their key allies. But when we see that, let's recall, what was the point of NATO? What was the point of setting it up in the first place? Always the idea, and what was the point of splitting Germany? It was to keep Germany in its box. And that appears to be still a key element of American foreign policy. So these sanctions on Russia are really, in effect, a direct attack on European economies, meaning that Europe becomes much more dependent on US oil and stops trading with the Russians for cheap oil. That's partly why our bills are going up so much, because of the sanctions. I mean, it's a direct result of American foreign policy that people in this country are suffering so much because of the huge increase in oil prices. So I think that's one of the things which we don't really understand about this whole process. People talk about Ukraine and whether you should support the Ukrainians or what you think about the conflict. And I would be happy to have an argument about that. But really, what we're seeing here is a direct attack by America on Europe. And people really ought to get to grips with that, because that's not going to go away.
No, you notice, my point would be that the reason why these countries don't bother is because the globalists in those countries are globalists. Their nationality means nothing to them. That would just be my cynical old lefty description of it. Yvonne, with the US, we know you don't mess with the US when it comes to their money. As Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or other countries throughout the world can say, when you threaten the US dollar. Now, Saudi have gone beyond that. The fact that they're trading in foreign currencies, the fact that they're going to go into BRICS with China and Iran and Russia, the dreaded enemies of the US, are the Saudis putting themselves in position for a regime change, the usual American tactic of causing disruption? You're on mute. You're muted.
Sorry. If there is a regime change in Saudi, it won't be because of global affairs. It'll be because of internal affairs with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. I think that the Saudis are sensing that there is a new world order taking place. And, you mentioned BRICS, which is Russia, Brazil, China, India, and South Africa. They now contribute 31.5% of global GDP, while the G7 countries' share has fallen to 30%. And this is amazing, and it shows that there is a tipping point now where China is and Russia and in South America, Brazil are moving forward as the countries to watch. And I think that the Saudis sense this. And that is why we had that spectacle last year when Joe Biden, who said he was going to turn Saudi into a pariah state over the assassination of the dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Joe Biden said, he wouldn't even take a phone call from Riyadh for the first few months that he was in office. And then we saw the world's media covering Biden visiting Jeddah. And he was almost belly dancing on the red carpet in front of the Crown Prince. And they fist bumped, and the smirk on the face of the Crown Prince just spoke volumes. He was basically saying, this is the man who said he was going to turn Saudi into a pariah state. And now look how he's on his knees begging us for better oil prices, for human rights. And of course, Joe Biden went away empty-handed.
Yeah.
And that particular event, I think, was a crossroads. I mean, Anas is better at interpreting these things than me, but that was a major turning point.
Yeah.
And what you have now also in the region are several crown princes like Mohammed bin Salman, who are competing against each other in the Gulf states. Who can build the tallest building? Who can put on the biggest sporting event? And it's the competition between these men is quite extraordinary. And again, the UAE has developed this relationship with Israel, which none of the other Gulf states have. And that, again, is also a potential tipping point.
The other one you mentioned earlier, Anna, so we know we haven't mentioned the big player in the room, Egypt. But the other one we should really say about it is Iran, which was almost a pariah state with a few exceptions of countries. And it's now, it seems, coming back into the fold with its getting back together with Saudi, and there seems to be moves afoot. Iran's a big player in the Middle East.
Of course, Iran is one of the major powers. I mean, when you're talking about that particular region, you have to mention Iran, you have to mention Turkey, you have to mention Saudi Arabia, and in the past, you had to mention Egypt, but no more, unfortunately. Now, I personally, I have my problems with Iran, basically because of its role in Afghanistan, its role in Iraq, and its role in Lebanon. I see, as well as Syria. I mean, I'm sure that David probably will disagree with me here, but I see that their role was extremely detrimental. But coming back to Iran, Iran is a major power. And to be honest, it's played the political game with Europe and with the United States absolutely brilliantly. Mm-hmm. I mean, there can be no question that a country the size of Iran that was blockaded, has been blockaded now for decades, isolated economically for decades, to be able during that time to build the kind of political base, as well as the military base, as well as to expand, as well as to create this nuclear project amid all of those challenges is absolutely brilliant. I mean, there can be no question about it. Now, I might question the morality or the efficacy of their policies, but that's by the by. Mm-hmm. So yes, of course. I mean, Iran has basically has rubbed the West's faces in the dirt, and the West is in a way at the behest of the Iranians. So yes, I mean that's absolutely true. But I'd like to come back to something that Yvonne touched upon in regards with the Saudis. I don't think it's too difficult to understand why it is that Biden has had to go back and to do a massive, huge U-turn on his own oath. And only recently we've seen someone like Congressman Lindsey Graham go and share an iftar meal with the Crown Prince and get a photo opportunity of them, you know, smirking from ear to ear, when Lindsey Graham himself had previously said some horrendous things about Mohammed bin Salman himself and about the Saudi regime. It's very simple, and to be perfectly honest, and this might be an absurd thing. I can't even believe I'm going to say this. To be perfectly honest, I miss Donald Trump. I actually miss him. And you know why? Because he said it like it was. He was an absolute, you know, turnip. But, you know, he said it like it was. When he came out and in a press conference, when he said, most likely it was the Crown Prince who ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And then he was challenged, well, why don't we sever ties? He said, because essentially, if we're going to sever ties, it'll mean that the Russians will go and get hundreds of billions of dollars instead, and hundreds of millions of thousands of jobs. And he said it like it was. He said it's about money. It's about commercial interests. Human rights don't really matter. Fine, we're sad about Jamal Khashoggi, boo-hoo. But, you know, we have contracts to ratify. We have money to win. We have, and unfortunately, today's politicians, and I have to say, I mean, also coming back to something that David said a little bit earlier, the problem that we have on a global scale, and this might appear quite vividly in the case of America and Europe, but the fact that we have so lacking of any intellectual prowess, of any weight, academically, intellectually, any ideas, no one is coming up with any ideas. We have, at best, whether it be in the UK, whether it be across Europe, whether it be in the United States, we have accountants for prime ministers and presidents. Sometimes we have cash registers. I mean, we have no one who has the intellectual depth in order to come up with new ideas. And for that reason, we are seeing so lacking a sense of morality. I mean, we're asking for morality. We're asking for efficacy. There is none of that simply because there is no weight behind. It's just about numbers, crunching numbers. That's all there is to do. And unfortunately for that, we are seeing that kind of shift away from the United States. But the challenge that we face, and this is something we have to contend with, and that is when you have someone of depth. Now, you might disagree with them, absolutely. I can mention some politicians whom I'd rather not pollute your show, Roddy, with mentioning. But, you know, you could see that whilst you absolutely disagree with them, that there is some weight behind their thoughts and ideas. Now, the problem is when you have that lacking, is that the only course to go is brutality, is military force, is guns and missiles. That's the only way to go, because there is nothing else in that arsenal. There is nothing between those ears. And that's what we have to, unfortunately, expect and foresee for the next generation. Now, that, I think, has alerted many in that particular region, including the Saudis, including even the Emiratis, by the way, even though they may be on different sides, to the fact that, by the way, these people aren't that clever. And therefore, we can sort of, you know, twist their arms. We can tell them, listen, stop mentioning about our human rights, because we can also highlight your own problems and your own human rights. So don't lecture us. You know, okay, so we've killed Jamal Khashoggi, but how many have you killed in Iraq? How many have you killed in Afghanistan? So we can, you know, there are two that can play this particular game. And you know what? You're not the only marketplace. We go to China. China won't mention Jamal Khashoggi. You won't mention human rights. We go to, you know, Russia, and they won't bring these things up. We'll be equals on the table. So I think that what we're seeing, we might be talking about the Middle East specifically, and there's a lot to be said. But I think that on a global scale, we are heading somewhere. On one scale, because of me being a political analyst, extremely interesting. But from the humanitarian point of view, from the global point of view, I think it's going to be a very, very, very tough period to come.
Just on Trump, someone said to me, he's the first president since the end of the Second World War that hasn't started a new war. There's Trump, and I know what you're saying.
Factually, it's true.
And I was watching him on an interview. This is even where you think you were bad. Listen to this. Being interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and I found myself nodding my head. And so, you're right. I could disagree with probably 99.9% Donald, but he comes out with some things that you go, yeah, he's right. But what do they say about even a broken clock's right twice a day? So I'm hiding behind that. David, on Iran, this rapprochement with Saudi, if it holds, that's got to be good for the peace of the region, surely. But can it hold?
Oh, I think it will. I think that this is a tendency now. I mean, it's part of a bigger tendency. The fact that the Chinese brokered this, Chinese said to the Saudis, guys, we've got business with you. We don't want to jeopardize that. And that's the power of the Chinese to be able to do that is extraordinary. Belt and Road, the Chinese initiative, connecting, 145 countries now, including up to all the way from China, all the way through Asia, Eurasia, and Europe, up to Italy even, and then down through Iran and by sea, by road, and by rail. This is an extraordinary thing.
Heading towards Central Africa, by the way, David. Heading towards Central Africa.
Indeed. And this is an extraordinary thing. It's not, and it's set. Western propagandists say, "Oh, this is they're going to keep people in debt," and maybe there's an argument about that. But actually, this is not like Western imperialism. This is just not like Western imperialism, and that people understand that now. And you can see that, as you say, Anas, in the various statements that have been made in various different African countries in the last 3 or 4 weeks. People say, "Well, what's our problem with Russia? What's the problem with China? They do not treat us like the West treats us," and that's a key thing. People talk about, especially on the left in this country, talk about imperialism, and they talk about Ukraine as being a clash of imperialisms, and I don't want to get into the question about whether Russia is an imperial power or not. I mean, but actually, on the ground, when you hear people from the global South talking about Russia and China as compared to the West, there is no contest. There is one set of approaches to the world, which is that you invade and you steal and you lie and you cheat and you kill, and that's the Western way. And the Chinese don't have that approach, and the Russians don't have that approach. Whatever we might say about, and no doubt, as Anna said, no doubt we might disagree about Russian foreign policy in Syria or whatever. But this is a global change, and it's not stoppable. There might be problems along the road, people might fall out, but this is a move towards multipolarity, and we're seeing it happen at a rate of knots. Every day there are new things which happen and which you hear about. The Russian agreement with Venezuela just yesterday or today, whatever it was, the Russian naval boats docking in Brazilian harbors after the Americans told them not to, and the Brazilians said, yeah, that's fine. And these things happen all the time, and we're in an unstoppable process now towards multipolarity, and it will reshape West Asia as well as reshaping the relations of the world. And the question for us, and maybe this is the Scottish Prism question. The question for us in Britain, right, is what we do about that. Now, in Scotland, you have a potentially slightly different question, which is, if we can get independence, what do we do? And of course, last time I lived in Scotland when the referendum happened, I was one of the 55% of the people in Glasgow who voted yes, along with 3 other council areas. The most deprived council areas in the country voted yes, as you'll remember. If independence was a possibility, then it would need to be, in order for us to deal with these issues, it would need to be with its own currency, outside NATO, and as an ally. I mean, let's put it this way: maybe Scotland, an independent Scotland, should join the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement organization, and apply to join the BRICS. Maybe the MIR system should start to operate in Scottish bank tellers. All of that stuff should be openly and explicitly on the table for discussion in the independence movement, because otherwise you will be stuck with the rump, what's it called, RUK, which doesn't show much possibility of being moved to a position where it would leave NATO. Although that is the obvious thing that Britain should do if it wants to have a place in the new world.
Yeah, well, I think there could be a debate. We could have a programme on will the NATO and EU survive the Ukraine war. That's another programme all on its own. But just a couple of things that you said, if it gets independence on this programme, it's when, David, just to keep you right, when Scotland gets its independence. There's no if about it. Okay, just don't want to be pedantic. But one of the other things, David, just if I could, while I've got you there, you were on about the EU and the bad points about it being, you know, global and all that. But one of the things that was formed, I think one of the main forming of it was for peace, because Europe was sick of the wars. We did 2 world wars in 1 century, and it was, you know, it's been fairly successful in that till recently, until, you know, the Balkans and now into Ukraine. But surely in the Arab world, if there was some typical, you know, the Gulf states were expanded into a European Union type situation, working towards a single currency, working so that they can avoid conflicts in future. Surely that would be a good thing.
I'm not sure it would. I mean, I think
that's just never going to happen.
I'm not sure it would. I mean, I think that what we see at present in the expansion of the BRICS and of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a direct riposte and mirror image of the EU process. The EU process, the single currency was for market reasons. It wasn't to help human rights or to help development. It was for market reasons, for the corporations. The EU model is not something which West Asia should adopt because it would lead to more conflict. What needs to happen in West Asia as a whole, of course, is that there needs to be a turning away from US power, and also there needs to be a resolution of the Palestinian question. Yvonne said that she wasn't calling for Israel to be wiped off the map. Well, actually, there should be no Jewish state in Palestine. There should be one state which all its citizens can be members of. That's the only viable solution for Palestine. And as with all other settler colonies, I would point to the north of Ireland, to Algeria, to South Africa, to Zimbabwe. The only way to resolve a settler colonial situation, well, sorry, there are 2 ways. First way to resolve a settler colonial situation is what happened in Canada, America, New Zealand, and Australia. You execute and eliminate, you genocide the natives, right? Now, that's, of course, what the Israelis are trying to do in Palestine. But if we don't want to go that way, which I don't think really anybody in West Asia and in the BRICS countries, etc., would want to do, then you have to end the settler colonial occupation of Palestine. And that means, fundamentally, it means removing Zionist power as a serious element in the conflict, so that you just have citizens of Palestine. And that's the only way to do it. Now, that is and will be the consequence of the tendencies which we're seeing with multipolarity. Now, it's not a straightforward process, but it is a process which the unity that there is now in the axis of resistance and the emerging role of China and Russia will bring to the forefront of history, and we're heading towards the moment where there will be a resolution to the question of Palestine.
Yeah, that's the thing, Yvonne, is the US loses influence, and as it is, and as Russia and China gain it. One of the things I find quite ironic about it is when the times of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher et al., and they decided that outsourcing manufacturing would be a great idea because they could increase profits and get rid of pesky trade unionists, and they sent all this manufacturing capability to China and to Vietnam and to all these countries where they didn't see what would come, and it's now coming back to bite them in the bottom. And it could be the undoing, and it could be actually the key to Palestine getting a fair crack at the whip if America can't crack its whip as much. You're forgetting that mute button, Yvonne.
Well, America never did crack whips. America looked at something and thought, how can America benefit from this? And then the foreign policy was formed around that. China's emergence is fascinating because as David mentioned, this Silk Road trade route, which involves so many different 79 countries across the world. And it is Xi Jinping's vanity project, if you will. But a lot of those countries are what we would term fragile states. And with the strong international political cooperation of China, this is going to help them get back on their feet again and do something positive. When deals have been done with America, it has always been to the benefit of America. For instance, in Afghanistan, new roads were built, but they weren't built by local Afghans. They were built by American contractors who had no idea of the climate and the challenges of building a road in a country which has freezing temperatures, has flooding, and all things that local contractors could have advised them on. Whereas when China goes into a country and wants something, it gives a big wedge of money without strings and says, go and build some hospitals. It doesn't say with Chinese contractors, with Chinese equipment. It is its style of approach is quite different. But I think that as yet the West has to wake up to the realities of the Silk Road economic belt, as it's or the Belt and Road Initiative, as it's known. I just wish that Belt Road Initiative was going to go through Gaza, because then we would see quite a different type of support and help that the Palestinians so desperately need. They've never had a superpower batting for them or using their influence over Tel Aviv in bringing about peace. And I was quite buoyed to hear David talk about a one state, because the rest of the world and all these woke politicians are all talking about a two-state solution. I would urge them, look at the map of Palestine and tell me how a two-state solution can work, because of all the land theft and land grabbing to accommodate nearly 500,000 illegal settlers. There is no two-state solution. It's gone. That ship has sailed. And so, you know, the answer is one country, call it anything you want, but have a country where the Muslims, Jews, and Christians can all live peacefully together. And so I agree with David, you know, the only solution is what is there already, the one state for everyone, including the millions of Palestinian refugees who are living in camps in Syria, in Lebanon, you know, and give them the right to return, which is recognized in the United Nations. You know, Iraq was invaded in 2003 because Saddam Hussein had violated or ignored about a dozen UN resolutions.
2, I think it was. No, 2.
Sorry. Yes.
Resolutions. 2 resolutions.
Yes. Well, well, that's why he was invaded, because he'd violated and ignored a few UN resolutions. Israel has violated and ignored around 200 UN resolutions, and yet it's getting away with it. And this uneven distribution of justice is why the Middle East is in the turmoil it is in at the moment.
I don't want to simplify it, but one of the things why we don't seem to be able to get to a solution apart from imperialism in the Middle East is the fact that the world's still carrying the conscience of the Holocaust. And a lot of people feel uncomfortable criticizing Israel because of that. And I ask, after all this time, when does that conscience turn to, we are where we are today? And I am not, before people start trying to discount or say how horrific the Holocaust was. But it seems to me, from a simplistic point of view, Anas, I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that.
No, absolutely, I would. I mean, I think that, the Holocaust was one of the most horrific crimes committed in the last century. There's no question about it.
Absolutely.
Then to give free hand to the victims and the children of the victims of that horrific crime to do as they wish and actually create their own Holocaust against another people, that's something that must be spoken about. And you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the crime, the bestiality of the Holocaust has basically been dissipated simply because it's been used by the Zionists, by the creators of Israel, by the proponents of Israel, as a batting stick against anyone who wishes or dares to criticize Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the Holocaust, Israel must be free to do as it may. And no one, absolutely no one, is to say a word against that. Now, it's extremely important that, this is an ABC lesson in history. That region that we talk about, whether it's West Asia, whether it's the Middle East, that region was time and again, across millennia, was the refuge of Jews who fled persecution from essentially Europe and the West.
Yes.
They came to that region to seek refuge. And therefore, where you go to, when you go to the capitals such as Baghdad, such as Damascus, such as Beirut, such as Cairo, you will always find a quarter called the Jewish Quarter, because that was where the marketplace for the Jewish community was. That was where they lived. That was where their synagogues were. That was where they worshipped, and they lived there for centuries, hiding away from the persecution that came upon them by the Europeans. So, I mean, it's once again, I add my voice to what David said. I mean, the two-state solution, I spoke many, many years ago. I mean, I think probably over 18 years ago. I spoke in the presence of the then Palestinian or PA ambassador here in London, who was a great friend, Aziz Safia. I spoke in front of him and I said, why are you talking about East Jerusalem, for God's sake? What about West Jerusalem? Why are you talking about a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem? Why are you saying these things? Have you given up on Haifa? Have you given up on, what are those? What are those? And because of his political position, he couldn't say anything, but he was absolutely in agreement. The two-state solution is dead, Let's go beyond that. The fact that not a single person who supports the current Israeli government is willing to come up and say, I support the two-state solution, is sufficient for us to say it's dead in the water. It's like, we have this joke in Arabic folklore that there was this shepherd, this boy shepherd, and he was once bragging to his friends, oh, I'm going to marry the princess. And they said, how are you going to marry the princess? You're penniless. You only have, that cloth on your back. How are you going to marry the princess? He said, well, listen, it's a 50% done deal. He said, how is that? He said, well, I've agreed. I've agreed to marry the princess. So it's a 50% done. It's like that. It's, we're talking about this two-state solution when the other party is not even interested, not even entertaining the idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we must see what happened in 1948 as an anomaly that created a crisis that continues until this very day. That anomaly must be undone. And we're not talking about driving people into the sea. We're not talking about mass massacres. By the way, mass murders, massacres, genocides, they funnily enough, despite that we're talking about this region that is most volatile and most, conflict ridden and the such, has never, ever occurred in that region. It's not within the DNA of the people of that region or the geography of that region to commit massacres. Massacres and genocides are things of the West. That's where genocides actually happen. So we're not talking about driving people into the sea. We're not talking about mass murder. We're not talking about genocide. We are talking about the restoration of justice. We are talking about the restoration of humanity to millions of people whose humanity has been absolutely torn from them over the past 75 years.
Yeah, I know you want to come in, Yvonne, on a point, and then I'll get to David.
Yes,
Well, I was just going to say to you, if I'm not mistaken, my history serves me right. Edward I, and back in those days of Longshanks, it was the Christian faith where you couldn't, as the Muslim faith is now, if I'm not mistaken again, you couldn't borrow money at interest. The only people who would lend money at that time were Jewish financiers. And Edward Longshanks, I think it was Edward Longshanks, it was certainly one of the kings of England, had borrowed a colossal amount of money. And because he couldn't pay it back, he expelled them. He persecuted the Jews and threw them out of England. But your point was?
Well, this is where Scotland can stand loud and proud. Scotland is the only European country never to have visited state persecution on the Jewish people.
What about Ireland? I wouldn't think Ireland would have done it either.
I don't know about Ireland, but I do know for a fact that Scotland, as I said, when we launched this program, Scotland has a great international reputation. And I am sure that an independent Scotland could punch well above its weight in international diplomacy. Look at the little state of Qatar, which is smaller than Scotland. It was one of the prime movers in ending the war in Afghanistan. And although, we're a small state, we're a small nation, I think that because of this history, we know what it's like to be persecuted. We know what it's like to be occupied. We know what it's like to feel the colonial boot on our neck. I think that Scotland could really make quite a big impact on the world stage.
I agree with you, David. As I say, the clock's kicking on, but I'd like your thoughts on what we've just been discussing, but also just as a last question, if you could answer for me, if everything that's going on, does it make you optimistic or less optimistic of we can have happiness in the Middle East?
Well, I think geopolitically and globally, I'm optimistic in the sense that multipolarity is real and it's happening and it's going faster than perhaps any of us thought it would. And I think that's a good thing overall for the world. But I'm pessimistic in the sense that the collapse of US imperialism will lead most probably to the US lashing out in ways which we will see when they come, and they will not be pleasant. In the context of living in Britain, I live in Bristol in the southwest of England. Sorry, my geography of England's not very good. We are in an increasingly censorious society. It's not just in my own case where I've been sacked from my an academic post, pretty unprecedented set of things happen to me, and I'm banned from speaking whenever I'm advertised to speak at a meeting. I'm banned. So that context, as well as the split on the left, and indeed in the anti-war movement over Ukraine, where you can be denounced as supporting fascists if you question NATO's actions in Ukraine. That's an indication, I think, of an increasing censoriousness in this country and an increasing inability to speak freely. The media are so overwhelmingly full of propaganda and bias, much more so than they were over Iraq in 2003, for example, that it makes it look. So I'm pessimistic about the future of politics in this country. When I say this country, I mean Britain. Of course, if there was an independent Scotland, when there is an independent Scotland, then that will change things. I mean, I think, you know, the dissolution of the United Kingdom state would be a world historical progressive thing. But we're not at that moment yet. And so I think I'm pessimistic about politics in this country, and pessimistic about the ability of people on the left to properly grasp multipolarity and what's happening, and not to be gulled essentially by NATO propagandists, which I see all the time.
Thank you. As you live in the southwest of England, if you ever want your back garden dug up, let me know, because I know that the powers to be listening to our podcast and my phone calls, and I'll just say, are the weapons still okay in the back garden, David? They'll be there. Your garden will be free. I can do that for you. That could be your fee.
I don't want my garden dug up.
Okay, so there's no weapons there, GHCHQ. Okay, there's none, not there. How's your garden, Anas? Your garden okay?
My garden is absolutely fine. I've paved it. So
okay, well we're okay. Anyway, just phone me up. I can get it organised for you. Just before I go, should I just say thank you very, very much, gentlemen, for your and Yvonne, for your contributions. Thank you for the education. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers will have as well, and I'm sure we'll need you back for more. On David's closing remarks, could I just say to the audience that next week we're doing a program like this midweek on the Ukraine war, the effects of it, the propaganda, the lies, all the stuff, the things you're not being told. We could probably get taken off the air, as David's alluded to, but we will be attempting next week to bring you more truth, the stuff that the corporate media don't give you, which is what we've done today. You've got the insights as it is. So thank you for watching, and until we see you all again soon, please, you and yours, take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.